Greetings and namaste, my YouTube community, fellow fans, followers, and friends. Welcome to another episode of How to Rock Astrology. My name is Dustin Cormier, and it is with great pleasure that I present to you the full, true story of the Nakshatra Gods, a very insightful novelette written by the great Vedic teacher, astrologer, and fellow YouTuber, Vic Dicara. Thanks for watching, folks. For those who are interested, the text that this novelette comes from is Nakshatra, the authentic heart of Vedic astrology. This book is, for those who probably know and who are aware of what's going on, this book is written by Vic Dicara, and it is his transliteration of the Titaria Brahmana. This is an important Vedic text written, it was written in the Krishna Yajurveda thousands of years ago, and this particular text talks about the nakshatras through these sutras, and these sutras are enigmatic little phrases, and each one phrase describes the essence of the nakshatra that it's talking about. So the Titaria Brahmana goes through all the nakshatras individually. In this book, Vic translates and gives commentary on the sutras of the Titaria Brahmana, and then at the very end of this book is when Vic Dicara gives us his great little novelette, as I call it. It's the true story of the Nakshatra Gods, and it's at the end of this book. It's something very precious. This is the Nakshatra Gods story is what this series is going to be talking about. Now, this video is just an introduction. Before we start, I should say, so I got permission from Vic Dicara. I emailed him. He's a very easy guy. Well, you can get a hold of him, although he has a lot of people who he tries to make available to get a hold of him. Thankfully, he gave me the permission, not exclusively or anything. Vic actually just wants to get the message out. He wrote the book not as a material thing that would get him money. He deserves it, and ultimately, I always recommend that you actually get the book yourself, because you absorb information in a different way when you read, and plus you're supporting Vic Dicara as the author of this book. But I asked him if I could do something like this and go word for word from his text, and he said that I could, because he just wants to get the word out, like I said. Now, that being said, it is important for me to note here, before we start, that Vic Dicara is very meticulous about the details in his exposition of astrology and Vedic philosophy, and he would not be pleased with anybody misrepresenting his approach. Therefore, usually when I read anything, I'm constantly doing my own commentary on it. In this series, I will do my best to remain as close as possible to the original writing of Vic Dicara. And I'm going to give it as little of my own commentary as possible. I'm strictly here as a messenger in this series. I want this present introduction in this video to be a worthy encapsulation, and this is kind of coming from my own words, obviously. This video that we're watching today, it's kind of in my own words, my own derivation of what's going on, of what Vic Dicara is all about, and of what this article is all about. Just keep in mind that since it's coming from my own words, it's not coming strictly from Vic Dicara. If you really want to get the essence of his work, obviously I would recommend you check out his own YouTube channel, and you can look him up on Google, and he's easy to find. Or you can find his website, and he will give all of his material. In fact, Vic Dicara's book here is really a great, important book. He has a wonderful video educational course that he offers. I don't know if he does it like occasionally or whatever, where he will actually answer your questions. And he's got questions to give you. It's like a school to learn about his application of this nakshatras through his understanding of it. I highly recommend that course. I really only was able to get halfway through it, and I'm still kind of chewing away at it slowly. It's full of all of the wisdom needed to interpret planets in the nakshatras and to interpret the nakshatras in general. That being said, we are here today, and you guys are hanging out with me in order to get an audiobook version of the Nakshatra Gods novelette. Now, thanks so much for coming, folks. I hope you guys enjoy this video introduction, and I hope you enjoy this series. Now, let's have a little bit of background on Vic Dicara. Many of you know Vic Dicara as one of the famous pioneering proponents of Tropical Vedic Astrology. Now, Tropical Vedic Astrology, it wouldn't be right to call it a movement, because as Vic Dicara often notes, in his interpretation, tropical astrology has always been the only original astrology to practice. He's pretty adamant about that as a proponent of tropical astrology. So, there are many others in this camp as well, and there has been those who have been in this camp even before Vic Dicara. It just so happens that in the world of YouTube these days, the realization of tropical astrology as being a valid framework for applying the ancient counseling techniques of jyotish, that's traditional Indian astrology, the realization that tropical astrology works with Vedic philosophy is a burgeoning movement in the YouTube community right now, and it's hotter than it's ever been because of YouTube and because of people like Vic Dicara. Again, I just like to reiterate that the idea that Vedic astrology should be applied through tropical measurements of the planets and the positions of the planets is something which, according to Vic Dicara, has been the proper thing all this time. Now, there's a debate going on in the world between tropical and sidereal. For those watching, I want to remind you that this video series is not going to matter if you're tropical or sidereal. I'm mentioning it here because it's a big part of Vic's work, and it's a part of what he advocates in his work on on YouTube and in all of his work. So he's an avid tropical practitioner. However, for this series, we are talking about the nakshatras, which, according to Vic, is not tied in with the rashis or the signs, the 12 the 12 signs of the zodiac: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, etc. According to Vic Dicara, the nakshatras are a cycle, they are an astrology all unto themselves, and they are not married to the signs, which means that if you practice using tropical-based signs or sidereal-based signs, this series will be good for you regardless, because the story that Vic unfolds here is the story of the deities of the nakshatras and the symbolism of the nakshatras, which is not astronomical or astrologically based. It's scripturally based. It's based on numerology and philosophy and Sanskrit literature, essentially. So, whatever camp you're in, this series is for you. But I'm going to speak a little bit to the Ayanamsha issue just so that people know what we're talking about here. So, you may ask, what else is there aside from tropical astrology? I'm just going to give this short thrift. Essentially, tropical astrology, tropical and sidereal, are two frameworks for calculating the positions of the planets and their cycle around the sun. It can get hazy in terms of how how to define tropical versus sidereal, because Vic, I'm saying this because Vic is so meticulous about it. If you really want to know what's going on here, again, I recommend you check out his own work. For me to give it a quick flash in the pan vision of what's going on here, we know that astrology is largely about the planets in their cycles around the galactic plane of the planets in their cycles around the sun. For example, Saturn, we know, is debilitated in Aries. The sun is exalted in Aries. So when Saturn is in Aries, we know, we can scientifically observe that anybody with that position should be having difficulty with things related to Saturn. Therefore, the position of Aries is going to be very important in defining the strength and the expression of Saturn in a person's chart. And therefore, it's important for us to know where Aries is in the sky. You'd think it would be simple, but the problem with this debate is, where do you start a circle? Because a circle has no beginning and no end. So there's a debate on where exactly the start of Aries going around the sun is supposed to start. Essentially, there's a 23-degree gap into these two different systems. Half of the astrology world thinks that Aries starts at a certain point, and then the other half of the world in the tropical sphere thinks that Aries starts basically 23 degrees away from what that point was 2,000 years ago. It's a hotly debated topic. I recommend, again, to check out Vic's work if you really want to get the nuts and bolts on it. Ultimately, this video series, I brought that up because this is what Vic Dicara is known for in the early onset of his work on YouTube. Once he laid it out, we started getting into, okay, now that everybody knows my system, how do I interpret and use the system that I abide by? So all of his stuff coming from, all of his later stuff on YouTube and his work is all about talking about the Nakshatras in particular, because of his unique grasp on the cosmology of the Nakshatras and the Rashis, the 12 signs, and how they're different. This video series is not strictly tropical or sidereal. Since we're talking about the Nakshatras here, which, according to Vic Dicara, is an archetypal wheel that exists entirely separate from the 12 signs of the zodiac, you should be able to enjoy this series whether you practice tropical or sidereal astrology. The story of the Nakshatra Gods, which we're going to find in this book, is really a work of Vedic mythos, whose value is universal. Everybody can use the wisdom of the Nakshatras and the gods and deities that preside over the Nakshatras. Vic's work, The Nakshatra Gods, this little novella that he's written, it's a condensed compendium of all forms of wisdom and grace available to mankind. I guess I should say that the Nakshatras are this condensed compendium of all the wisdom available to mankind, and Vic has made this tiny little bite-sized condensation of the symbolism of the gods given in the Nakshatras. So Vic's narrative is not written in a sutra. It's his own hashing of the literature of India and the literature of the Vedas that has come since the very earliest parts of the Veda, since that they were handed down. So this is Vic's own writing, describing in his own intuitive way what it all means, what it's all for. Now, he boils the whole Vedic thread of wisdom down into a palatable story, full of insight, and specifically rich wisdom relating to the roots of Vedic thought. And that's why this book, this article, is something that Vedic and Sanskrit enthusiasts will thrill over. So we should note that the Vedas sort of unfold like a pulp fiction novel. This is me at this point. I'm starting to get into the guts of the contents of what we're going to be reading here. The Vedas kind of unfold like a pulp fiction novel. What do I mean by that? The earliest recognized protagonist given by the Vedas is the Lord of impartial judgment, Varuna, whose intellect and thousand eyes of vision must judge all energetic pathways with equilibrium. There's a cosmic ontology here that is being expressed by Varuna being mentioned first. We're going to talk about this, about how Varuna represents the earlier understanding of Vedic consciousness. Varuna, as an eternal element of reality, represents the personification of divine authority. He's the main subject in the earlier Vedic texts, the Purva, prior Vedic texts. And he begins to fall out of importance in later texts when the later Vedas begin to describe the legendary and heroic and often ego-driven exploits of the character of the rain god, Indra, a very colorfully illustrated character in Vedic literature. The reason I said that the Vedas kind of unfold almost like a pulp fiction novel is because there's a deeper backbone than just Varuna in the beginnings of creation through the Vedas. For example, Agni, Kritika, is often, in many texts when people talk about what the Nakshatras are all about, most of the time they start with Agni. Agni is the inceptual spark of all things, and Vic kind of even makes mention of this. Other authors who describe the Nakshatras and their meaning, they often begin with the goddess Aditi, because Aditi is the progenitor, the mother of Varuna. Varuna is one of her 8 or 12 children, depending on how you depending on the numerology that you're applying the 12 or 8 Adityas to. Vic is going to explain that as we go into the series. So Aditi kind of is the mother of Varuna. Therefore, there's a story behind Varuna that got him to where he is, obviously, right? But as we learn, Varuna is given status as the most capable son of Aditi. And this is why Vic and even the Vedas sort of start with Varuna as the main character and main protagonist. So the first section of this, of Vic's Nakshatra Gods, really talks about Varuna mostly. Here I want to say, so this is just how this whole story unfolds. And it's interesting that there's even the Hindu Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are given a select episode in Vic's narrative. In fact, he refers to the Hindu Trinity as part of the Uttara, or the consolidating, the ultimate part of the Veda. And this is the part of the Veda, it's the latter part. It's concerned with jnana, wisdom, and knowledge of the liberation of bondage from karma. Very important stuff. Now, this is important to consider. Really, the Purva, or initial early part of the Vedas, which involves most of the Nakshatras, Varuna, the Adityas, Aditi, this is all stuff that's contained in the Purva section of the Vedas. And the Purva part of the Vedas relates to rituals and actions. It's kind of like the conceptual framework of karma, whereas the Uttara dimension of the Vedas talks about what do you do with it? How do I turn the elements of karma into transformation, which is really the Raj Yoga of it all, the meaning of the karma that's been laid out for us. Astrology and Jyotish, in fact, is typically considered, according to Vic, it was considered to have been a part of the Purva dimension of the Vedas. Jyotish and astrology, they're really mostly concerned with when we should perform certain actions or when we shouldn't. Now, this is, again, it's a spider web of time. It's kala. It's essentially the elements of the chessboard. The Uttara Vedas tell us how to play chess. Okay? So, the Uttara school is what can churn the ghee of the actions and rituals of Jyotisha, of ancient Jyotisha, astrology, to effect true inner transformation and self-realization from within. So the Bhagavad-Gita, the Srimad Bhagavatam Purana, and the stories of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, these all come from this Uttara school of what I kind of consider the Vedic New Testament. It's my, Christian people will get what I'm kind of playing with there. The Old Testament of Abraham and Moses generally is like the Genesis of Jehovah, and the New Testament is the Jesus Christ figure saying, how do we transmute the karma that has come and turn it into self-realization within? So, in the same way, Purva Veda is about the elements of karma. The Uttara Vedas are all about what do you do with it in order to make it Christ consciousness. There is even a little bit of a resemblance here. Again, this is my own kind of little bit, but there's, in my opinion, this sort of correlates with the Western magical idea of the 3 different ages of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. The age of Isis typically correlates with Varuna in the Purva part of the Vedas. The age of Osiris in the ego of the individual comes into play when we consider Indra. And finally, with the ego slain, the hanged man of the tarot and all these sorts of things related to the age of Horus and Christ consciousness, this is what the Uttara part of the Veda is all about, which includes Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, Bhagavad-Gita, the Puranas, etc. So, this is a dispensation of the general gist of what's going on in this series. So, while the works of other authors often begin with either Kritika or Aditi being Punarvasu, Vic Dicara follows the pulp fiction narrative and begins with Varuna, just like this progression does. Vic Dicara ties all the cosmic sheaths together in the first section, entitled The Usurper of Paradise. And this talks about Varuna, which concludes with Indra coming to the forefront and walking into the spotlight. Sections 1 and 2 are really about coming from Varuna, going into Indra consciousness. Now, in section 3, Indra and Varuna's mother Aditi, or Punarvasu, is finally addressed in section 3. And then the last section, section 4, is going to talk about Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and how they relate to the story of the Nakshatras. All in all, Vic Dicara's little novella here is a great little condensed diamond of Vedic thought. And I'm very happy to be sharing it with you here on YouTube and going through it with you. So without further ado, we could talk about it all day, but I think I'm just going to jump into it. This is our first, this is just, this is going to be the end of this video. And this is going to be Vic's synopsis of his intentions for this story. This is in Vic Dicara's own words, the true story of the Nakshatra Gods. Vic tells us, "What follows is my compendium and telling of the tales of the gods who own the Nakshatras. These tales are pulled together from scattered places throughout the Vedas, the Puranas, and the Mahabharata. By knowing these tales, you will have a rich and deep way to more fully, contextually, and intuitively understand the true nature of the nakshatras that the deities own. Each detail of each story is extremely important. To really understand the nakshatras, please read and reread, or please listen and re-listen to these tales many times, visualizing them deeply." This is Vic's introduction, and this has been my introduction, ladies and gentlemen, to an important part of Vic's now, in my opinion, classic writing, Nakshatra, the Authentic Heart of Vedic Astrology. So I hope I do it justice. I can't wait to just bring it out. I'm going to be trying to do this all throughout December. Not just December, but the early, the end of this 2021 and the start of 2022, I'm going to unfold it. So for those watching with me, I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoyed this introduction, and I hope everybody enjoys this very important little story conceived of, or at least put together and organized by Vic Dicara. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you soon on the next one.